Welcome to the first GCSE History walkthrough for the 2024 series. We're going to begin with paper 1 and looking at the historic environment. This is part of your first examination, which will be on the 15th of May. My name is Katie Matthews. I work as part of the Harris Federation as a senior history consultant, and we also have Ben.
So I'm Ben Armstrong. I'm a subject specialist and I work with Pearson Edexcel, specialising in GCSE History.
So what are we aiming to cover in this video? Well, ultimately, we want to make sure that you understand the structure of the paper, look at some of the focus of the questions and general tips and advice. So we'll begin by looking at what the paper actually looks like, top tips for the historic environment, how to answer the questions, and some general tips for revision. So what does paper 1 look like?
So paper 1 consists of two parts, section A and section B. In this video, we're only focusing on section A, which is called the historic environment. Later on, you'll also need to consider section B, the thematic study. So the paper overall is 1 hour and 15 minutes, and it's worth 52 marks. Now, section A that we're going to focus on in this video is worth 16 marks out of 52. That makes it about 10% of your overall GCSE, which shows how important it is to revise well for this part of the exam. In terms of paper 1 exam, though, you can see in the little shape at the side on the right of your screen, it's only about 1/3 of the marks for this exam. So although you've got 1 hour and 15 minutes for the entire exam, you really want to aim to spend something like 1/3 of your time on section A. So that would mean something like 25 minutes. The main focus of section A is our historic environment study. And what that means is studying a particular place in a particular period of time. And the main focus, as you're going to see when we talk about the questions, is source skills.
So what are the different historic environments that students might be studying then, Ben?
So the 4 thematic study options for paper 1 are connected to 4 historic environments. For example, if you're studying crime and punishment in Britain, that means that your historic environment will be Whitechapel, 1870 to 1900. If you're studying medicine in Britain, you'll be looking at the British sector of the Western Front, 1914 to 1918. If you're doing warfare in British society, your historic environment is London and the Second World War. Or if you're studying migrants in Britain, your historic environment is Notting Hill, 1948 to 1970.
Right, let's have a look at some kind of general top tips then for the historic environment. And the first piece that I would give to my students at any time is to make sure they know what they need to do for this historic environment. And number one kind of go-to place is always a document that's called the specification. Now, your teacher should be able to help you locate this, or it is available online through the Pearson website. And what it does is it tells you exactly what you need to revise. So you can see at the top of this section here, it tells you the topic content. So you can try looking at the specification and then thinking, right, do I need to revise this section, or actually should I focus more here? Then underneath for the historic environment section, it's got this really handy section about the knowledge of the different types of sources you need to be familiar with. So it might tell you that you need to understand about newspapers as sources, or punch cartoons that you really want to be familiar with. So how do we make sure that we understand how the historic environment links to this paper as a whole? As Ben said, in this video, we're just looking at a small section, section A, but it fits into the wider thematic paper. So, for example, for the medicine paper, the medicine thematic, your historic environment would be World War One, and that fits into key topic 4 of the overall thematic. So the kind of chronology you need to be aware of, that World War One would fit into obviously the period of 1914 to 1918, which is the same as your thematic key topic 4. So knowing how they link can really help you understand your key knowledge by knowing what happened before as well as what happened afterwards. Let's have a look at some of the questions. So what do the questions look like in the historic environment? Well, you've got 3 main questions that you need to answer. When you first open the paper, you're going to have a describe 2 features of question. That's going to be testing your knowledge of the historic environment and is worth 4 marks. Then you've got a package of 2 source questions, getting you to analyse 2 sources from the period, and then a question that's framing a historical kind of inquiry as well. Right, so let's dig a bit deeper into those questions. Right, so let's have a look at the describe 2 features question. What's it all about, Ben?
So the opening question on the exam is describe 2 features of, and then it will name a topic from your historic environment. This question is a great opening question, and it's a good way to calm down and focus in the exam, because the examiner is simply looking to see what you know about the topic in the question. You need to describe 2 features of the topic, adding an extra point of information to develop each of the ones you've selected. So the examiner really is looking for your knowledge about the topic. It's a chance to show what you've revised or remembered about that particular topic. But what do we mean when we say a feature? Well, it really is anything you know that's relevant to that topic. So it could be what the topic was. It could be who was involved, what happened, or anything else you know that's relevant. But just one important reminder. This question is only 4 marks, and it only asks for 2 features, which means we want 2 short answers. It isn't a good idea to write longer answers, and it also isn't a good idea to try and give more than 2 features. That could use valuable time, which you might need later on in the exam paper. Here's an example of a full mark answer. This one's taken from the migration thematic study. During this video, you're going to see some examples, and they might not be from the thematic study that you've been learning. But don't worry, they're simply here to show examples of what answers might look like, and you can apply the principles to whichever thematic study you've been doing. First of all, take a look at the question. It says describe 2 features of, and this question always starts that way. And then we've got the topic, the British Black Panther movement in Notting Hill. How's this student answered it? Well, you can see that they've used the 2 spaces very well on the paper. They've put one feature where it says feature 1, and then they've put another feature where it says feature 2. That's a really straightforward way of structuring your answer, so you don't write too much or write too many features. Then they've written, one feature of the British Black Panther movement was that they were an organisation pressure group for the rights of black people. They've identified a feature. But can you see where we've underlined in blue? They've then added a little extra information, inspired by the Black Panther movement in America. That gets a 2nd mark. They've then answered a 2nd feature. It says another feature of the British Black Panther movement was that they were very often closely monitored by the police. So they've now identified a 2nd feature. And it's very important to notice that that's different to the 1st feature. Both of the features have to be different to each other. Then, underlined in blue at the end, they've again added a little extra information because the police was institutionally racist. Because they've given us 2 features and added a bit of information to each one, this is a full marks 4 out of 4 answer. It's important to notice They've not had to write a lot to get 4 marks.
Really great advice there, Ben. So why should students focus on the question topic?
It's really important to make sure that the features you give are about the question topic and not something different. So on the screen is an example that's from the medicine option. The question says, describe 2 features of the problems involved in transporting wounded soldiers away from the battleground. So the features really have to relate to those problems. What was it that was a problem for getting wounded soldiers away from the battleground of the First World War? But if you look at what the student has answered here, the soldiers could die on the way, so there has to be someone who is making sure the soldier stays alive. Well, this feature is about soldiers dying from their wounds. Yes, we know that soldiers did die if they were wounded, but the question is about the problems of transporting wounded soldiers. Because they've not given a feature which is about what the question's asking for, then this student got 0 marks.
Yeah, really easy trap for students to fall into there, definitely. Let's move on and have a look at the source utility question then. So this is question 2A. What's the question asking students to do?
So the question will always look the same way. It will say, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into? And then that will have a topic from your historic inquiry, something you've learned about. So we've got an example here, and this is from the crime paper. Again, don't worry if crime isn't your topic. This is just an example, and the questions will look the same whichever historic environment you've been studying. So it says, how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into how the conditions in Whitechapel affected policing? So the first key bit of this question is, how useful? Useful means, how far are the sources helpful for a historian who wants to learn about the topic? Or in other words, we could say, if a historian wanted to learn about conditions in Whitechapel and how they affected policing, how useful would these 2 sources be for that investigation? Then it points out which sources we need, sources A and B. It's really important that in your answer you give an answer about both sources, not just choose one of them and ignore the other. However, the question doesn't ask you to compare them, so it is okay to talk about source A and then talk about source B without trying to compare them. Then at the end, underlined in purple, we have the inquiry topic. It's a bit like what we already said on the first question, the features question. It's really important that your answer is connected to the topic in the question, not to other things that you might have revised.
Okay, let's maybe have a look at an example of one from the crime paper then, Ben.
So this is an example of a source. This source is actually an image. Remember that not all of the sources on your exam will be images. Some of them will be written. It's possible you'd have 2 written sources and no images at all, or you might have a picture like this one and then a written source. So you need to be prepared for whichever type of sources are on the paper. The first bit of information that's very important is the provenance. Some students forget to read the provenance. They just focus on the content of the source, either what it says or what the picture shows. But that provenance, or the information at the top which tells you about it, is there for a reason. It's written to help you answer the question, and it's likely going to contain information which you will find helpful in deciding how useful this source is. And then you have the source itself. As I say, this one's a picture, so it's important to take time to look very closely at the picture, or if it's a written source, to read it very carefully to see what it's saying or showing.
So what's the examiner actually looking for then in student answers on this one?
That's a good question, because understanding what the examiner wants on this question is key to being able to do a good job of answering it. And there's 3 important things. If you can get these 3 important things, then it's possible to get a really high mark. The first of the 3 things is the content. In other words, What is the source telling you about the inquiry topic? What is it that you can learn by looking at it or reading it that is relevant to the inquiry question? The second thing is the provenance. Remember, we said the provenance is the information with the source that tells you things like who wrote it or where it's from and so on. Well, what the examiner's looking for is, does that provenance make the source more or less useful for the inquiry? And the provenance could include the nature, by which we mean the type of source. Is it a cartoon? Is it a diary? Is it a speech? The origin, where's it from? Is it from a particular author? Is it from a particular country? When was it made? Or its purpose. Why was that source made? What did the person who created the source want to achieve when they made it? Were they trying to persuade someone? Were they trying to inform someone? Was it for entertainment? And by choosing a detail from the provenance, you need to decide, does that make the information more or less useful? Remember, just saying that a source is not reliable doesn't always make it less useful. The third thing we're looking for is your contextual knowledge. This is where you need to show that you have an understanding about what's going on in this period of history in that place. So does your knowledge support or challenge the source? Does what you know from your revision suggest that the source is accurate or inaccurate? Does it represent what was happening at the time, or is it not really typical of what you've learned about the period? Now, what's really important is that you cover all three of those points in your answer. So you need to have a point about the content. What is the source telling you that's useful or not useful? What is the provenance suggesting about how useful it is? And how does your contextual knowledge affect the usefulness? It's better to include one point about all of those three details than write lots and lots on just one of them and ignore the others. It's impossible to get a top level mark unless you've included all three of those aspects.
Yeah, I would totally agree. The amount of answers I've read that are just real in-depth analysis of the content with no mention of provenance and no knowledge, and just really kind of throwing away marks there. So really good advice. So let's have a look at an answer then and kind of break it down.
So this is an answer from the crime paper. And we're not going to show the sources. That might seem a bit strange, but here we're just looking for what the candidate has done. And what we've shown you on the screen is how they've done those three different points. So in red, we've got where they've used the content. It says source B is also useful for an inquiry as it shows the dangerous parts of Whitechapel, cramped and crowded, affected policing as they had to patrol this area too, which gave them less time to focus on Jack the Ripper. Don't worry too much about the content if you haven't studied crime. But what they've done here is they've looked at what the source is showing, which is a cramped and crowded area called Whitechapel. But they've not just described it, they've said why that's useful. The question was about how this affected policing. And so they've linked the content to how that would answer the question about policing in Whitechapel. Then in blue, they've used the provenance. It says, however, the nature of the source makes it limiting, as they could have exaggerated to publish their book, but also to draw attention from the authorities. So they've selected one detail, which in this case is really what they might have been trying to achieve because of the nature of their book and their purpose. They're trying to possibly exaggerate a message because they want the authorities to pay attention to something the author's worried about. So they're linking the provenance to the usefulness. And then in pink, we have contextual knowledge. Some students think they have to write loads and loads of contextual knowledge, but that's not the case. Here they've said, I know from my contextual knowledge that Whitechapel was a poor place where immigrants flocked and families stayed in one room, which was paid on a weekly basis. and they link that at the start of the sentence to saying the source is true. So they're using their knowledge to suggest that this is a useful piece of information because their knowledge supports what the source says. So in this answer, the student has done all three things. They haven't done, for example, content lots of times or provenance lots of times. They've done a point on content, a point on provenance, and then used some of their contextual knowledge. Most importantly, the whole answer is related to how useful this source is.
And it's like you said on the earlier question, that focus on the inquiry is really good there. And there's a really clear judgment that the student is making about how useful this source is. It's a really useful example. If we move on to question 2B then, that's the follow-up inquiry, which I know so many students get quite muddled with. So your advice would be really useful here, Ben. So what's this question all about then?
Yeah, I can understand why some students find this an intimidating question. It's really a chance to show your historical skills. That's what the aim of this question is. And once you understand what the question's getting at, I think it becomes a lot more straightforward and manageable. So really with question 2B, you have to imagine you're working as a historian. You've been sent out to research a topic because you want to write a book or an article about it. And you've found some historical sources, like sources A and B that you've just written about in question 2A. You've used the two sources to learn about your inquiry, so now you know a little bit about the topic. But it's time to carry on your research. You need to think about what you would do next as a historian to continue learning about the inquiry. What question will you choose to investigate to learn more? And what type of sources would be useful for finding out more about the question? And that's really what this question is aiming at, how you could carry on your research if you were a historian. So the question is structured with 4 answer spaces, and it does that to help lead you through what the examiner is looking for. So at the start of the question, it says, study source A. And that's a crucial detail not to miss. It will tell you which of the sources it's asking about. And if you answer about the wrong source, well, your answer won't be relevant. So make sure at the very beginning you check if it's asking about A or B, and then focus on the correct source. It then says, how could you follow up on source A, or it could have been B, to find out more about the effectiveness of the police in Whitechapel in 1888? The really important thing here is that that will always be the same inquiry topic as you just wrote about in 2A. So hopefully you've already been thinking about that inquiry when you answered 2A and decided how useful the sources were. This question will never be about a different inquiry. Then it says in your answer, you must give the question you would ask and the type of source you could use. Complete the table below. Now this question is worth 4 marks. So we don't suggest you spend too long on this question. About 5 minutes is probably right. And if you look with the spaces for answering, you can see there's only 3 lines or 4 lines for the last one. So the examiner isn't expecting a lot of writing, even for 4 marks. The first space in the answer says, detail in source A that I would follow up. Here, you need to select a detail, which could be a short quote or something in an image that you've noticed that you would want to follow up on. Then it asks you for the question you would ask. What would you ask to learn more? Now, just to be clear, it's what would you ask to learn more about the topic in the question. So in this case, the effectiveness of the police in Whitechapel in 1888. It doesn't mean what would you ask to find out if the source is true or not. You've already decided about the usefulness of the source in 2A. Then the third space says what type of source I could use. This is where it's useful. I remember, Katie, at the start, you mentioned about seeing in the specification the types of sources that might be useful. That's where it would be worth knowing some of those sources that you could use. You need to pick a source that is realistic and that probably exists. It isn't okay to say, I would go on the internet and find out more, or I would look in a textbook, or I would speak to someone who was alive then. It needs to be a source that might exist. And then finally, what would you hope to find in that source? It says how this might help answer my question. You need to justify your choice by saying what you would be looking for in the source.
Okay, should we have a look at a question then? Because I think that's really good advice, and particularly that, like, picking the source, that's sometimes where students fall down, or like you say, just completely ignoring the focus of the question and going off on a tangent of their own inquiry. So maybe let's unpick this one from the medicine and World War I historic environment.
Yeah, this is a good question. So it says study source A, so we know which source we're talking about. How could you follow up on source A to find out more about the problem of trench foot? And when we look at the example in a moment, remember that's the key to this question. How could we find out more about the problem of trench foot? So let's see the first answer. So this is a great example of a 4 out of 4 answer. And before we look at it, just notice how they haven't written loads and loads. It's actually quite short in terms of the number of words they've written. But because they've focused on the question in the right way, they've still got full marks. So how have they done it? Well, the first space, they've picked out a detail. And the detail's just a quote. Remember, the question was about the problem of trench foot, and they've picked out about 200 men with trench foot had to be evacuated from our section of the trenches. They don't need to explain it. They've just picked the detail. There's a mark. Then they've asked a question. They've actually tried a question and crossed it out, but the one they've left on the answer says, what was the treatment given to the men who had been evacuated due to trench foot? That's a great question. Remember, they need to inquire about the problem of trench foot. So asking about a treatment that was given is a really good way of asking a question to learn more. What about the type of source? Well, they've picked a realistic and sensible type of source. This is one that if you've studied the medicine option, you would need to know about. RAMC medical records. How would this source help them answer the question? Well, in the last space, they've said this would show me the different way doctors and surgeons would treat trench foot at the time. Even though it's only a short answer, it shows what they're expecting to find in the source. And so it explains why the source they chose is relevant for their question.
Really lovely example there, and you can see that focus on the question throughout. So you've got a bit that's kind of boxed in with a star. Why have you highlighted that bit in particular, Ben?
Yeah, this is quite an important detail for students who want to do well on this question. The most important bit of this question is the second step, coming up with a good question. And the reason I say that that's the most important bit is that the question is the key to being able to answer this inquiry. If you haven't got a good question, well, your source won't be relevant, because the source is only relevant for a mark if it answers the question that you've set in the second step. So if you haven't got a good question, well, you can't get a mark for the source. And if you can't get a mark for the source, you also can't get a mark for saying how the source would answer the question. So really, if you're aiming to get a high mark on this question, it's the second step that you need to focus the most attention on, coming up with a good and relevant question that's linked to the inquiry focus.
Really, really useful tip. Thank you, Ben. Let's have a look at another answer that doesn't quite do what we would want it to do.
Yeah, so this student, they've obviously tried hard and they've got 2 of the marks, but they've missed out on the 3rd and 4th marks. So it starts really well. They've picked out a quote. Remember, this question again is about the problem of trench foot. And they've picked out rubber boots provided for troops in the worst positions of trenches. Great, there's a mark. And then they've come up with a good question. Where was the worst position to be in the trenches, which would be most likely to lead to trench foot? Another example, what's really interesting is their question is completely different to the one you saw on the last answer. So we're not looking for a specific question, we're just looking for a question. Unfortunately, this student hasn't got the 3rd and 4th marks, because although they did come up with a good question, the source they've picked, it's too general and it actually wouldn't answer the question they've set. So they've said the type of source would be hospital records, which they'd use to show in the trenches which areas trench foot typically came from. Well, unfortunately, that sort of source wouldn't answer their question about which positions would be more likely to cause trench foot. Hospital records didn't include that kind of information because hospital records were there to deal with the patients who came through the door. We're not saying that the question's not a good one, just that they'd need to pick a better source. For example, if they're wanting to think about the positions in the trenches where soldiers might get trench foot, perhaps they might want to think about records from the trenches themselves, perhaps even medical records from the first aid posts, where they might have recorded the types of problems that that soldiers were turning up with. Because the source they've picked isn't relevant, then that also means they can't get the 4th mark for saying why the source would answer the question, because it wouldn't answer the question.
Really useful, thank you, Ben. Should we just have a look maybe at one more example? As we said, students do struggle with this one sometimes.
So this is a different example. This is taken from the migration topic, so it's about Notting Hill. But in this example, although the student has attempted to give an answer for all 4 parts, they've actually only got 1 mark out of 4. So let's just see where it didn't work for this student. The question says, study source A. How could you follow up source A to find out more about Caribbean cultures in Notting Hill in the 1960s? So we're looking for the students to pick out a detail and then come up with an inquiry to find out more about Caribbean culture. Well, they've got a mark for a detail. They've paraphrased the source, although they've not quoted it. Paraphrasing can be acceptable if it's done well. And they've said the culture of Caribbean communities, which is a line referred to in the source. But then the question they've asked isn't really an inquiry. They've simply reworded the exam paper question. How is the culture of Caribbean communities in London? Well, that's not a question that would help them find out more about Caribbean cultures. Do you remember I said earlier how important that question is if you're going to get the rest of the marks? If you haven't got a good question, well, you can't get the 3rd and 4th marks. And so, although they have identified a type of source, they've said a photograph, they wanted a photograph of a party with Caribbean people dancing together, and they've tried to come up with a reason. Because they didn't come up with a good question in the 2nd part, they can't score the marks for the source or for how the source would answer their question. And that means, unfortunately, even though they've attempted to fill all the spaces, this student only gets 1 mark out of 4.
That's a really useful kind of talk through there. And I think definitely that what's coming out really clearly to me that we always tell our students is really just focus on the question, otherwise you're going to lose some really easy marks. And a perfect example there of just picking out a quote from the source and making sure that you're not leaving any questions blank and just really giving it a go is a really great piece of advice for our students. Let's have a quick look then to finish up on this video on how we would best advise students to really revise effectively for this historic environment part of the paper 1. Now, as we said at the beginning, this is only one section of the paper, so bear that in mind firstly in terms of the amount of time that you spend revising it. And our first piece of advice would really to go back to that document that I mentioned at the beginning, to the specification, which is available on the website, or your teacher will be able to help you find it. A really great top tip is picking out, as we said, kind of the content and the knowledge that you need to know. So for example, here, you need to have knowledge around the British sector of the Western Front. So what is the Western Front? You need to know that. You need to know about Flanders and northern France, the Ypres salient. Make sure you know what all of these words mean. And then it especially here picks up on some of the battles, the Battle of the Somme, Arras and Cambrai, making sure you have some general knowledge about each of these different areas of the content. Now, what I like to do when I was revising for my GCSEs and what we advise our students to do is maybe use something like flashcards. So on one side, you might write the name of a battle, and then on the other side, write some key knowledge. Then what I'd maybe do is get someone at home to test me on them or write out questions for them to test me on them as well. A really useful way to be revising all of that content that you need to know. Another big favourite for us as history teachers is encouraging you to make timelines. Obviously, we love a timeline. And using that specification, you can pick out what the key dates are, making sure you've got your key knowledge in the correct chronological order. So then when you're picking up on the sources and using those in the historic environment section of the paper, you can think, I know this, I know what was happening in the 50s in Notting Hill, and I know what comes after the event, so I might be able to talk about that as a consequence as part of my own knowledge. So really useful to have a general understanding of the context of each kind of decade for this one as an example. Any other top tips in there you would add, Ben?
I think just to say how important what you just said is about the dates. So for example, if you were to see a source on question 2A, that usefulness question, and it was set in 1960, it'd be really important to know that that's just after the Notting Hill Carnival and the Cochrane murder. On the other hand, if it was set in, say, 1957, it'd be really important to remember that things like the Notting Hill Carnival haven't happened yet. So you wouldn't want to go talking about them as if they've already happened. And so having that understanding is quite important, because often the date of the source is one of the important pieces of information you can pick out.
Yeah, and that's really useful for that provenance evaluation, definitely. And then whilst we're talking about sources, again, going back to the specification, it gives you a list. Doesn't matter which historic environment you're studying, whether that's crime or medicine, etc. It will give you a list of different sources the examiner expects for you to be comfortable with. So what I would be doing is writing myself down a list of all of these different sources, and then just try and expose yourself to as many of them as possible. So if, for example, you're studying Notting Hill, go and read some personal accounts and pick up on some of the tone and language used and what that tells you about Notting Hill at the time. Look at photographs, look at newspapers or whatever there is in the specification of the different types of sources that the examiner is really recommending that you have a look at.
It's also really useful for that question 2B, because sometimes students think, well, what sort of sources should I be picking to say how I could answer my own question? Well, if you're confident about the types of sources labelled here, then it's pretty likely you'll be able to think about a realistic source to answer and get that third and fourth mark in that question.
Yeah, totally agree. And then the last one, beyond reading lots of sources, is do lots of practice papers. Us as teachers, we are desperate for students to give us more in terms of homework and answers that we can give you some feedback on to really help you practice. And there's lots of exam questions available on the Pearson website. Your teacher will have loads that they'll be able to give you. If you've got revision books and textbooks, you'll be able to find them there as well as there being plenty more online. But definitely I'd be going to my teacher in the first place and then have a look at kind of what additional revision materials they can give you. So that's it in terms of our top tips for revision for the historic environment. Best of luck with the exam. We've walked you through each of the questions, so you now know what to expect. Do some revision, be confident, and have a go at every question on the paper.